Human activities may cause impacts and threaten biodiversity. The sociologist and ecologist Jared Diamond grouped these threats in 4 different categories, including habitat destruction, overexploitation, extinction chains, and introduction of non-native species. Being an excellent communicator and disseminator, he presented the clusters of impact as the Evil Quartet, referring to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. More recently, research conducted in the environmental field has led scientists to add 2 more categories to this list of possible impacts due to human activity: climate change and extinction synergies. So, today, we talk about an evil sextet rather than a quartet. We will now illustrate with some examples the impacts and threats that can be found in each of these categories. We can start with habitat alteration and destruction, which is one of the broadest categories, including many impacts ranging from land use change to pollution to habitat destruction. An example of habitat alteration on an almost global scale can be that of acid rain. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the emissions from human industrial activities, starting from coal burning up to automobile exhaust and forest fires, produce acidic substances such as sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. Such substances add to those produced by natural events, as volcanic eruptions and ocean foam. All these acidic substances may react with moisture in the atmosphere and produce acid precipitation, which may be transported long distance away from the emission source. Acid rain may cause a decline in forested habitats besides the acidification of soils and aquatic ecosystems. Acid rain has been found to be very hard on trees by washing away the protective film on leaves, weakening them and slowing down their growth, eventually killing them. Acid rain can also change the composition of soil and bodies of water, making them uninhabitable for local animals and plants, especially by lowering pH values below species tolerance. Another example of habitat alteration concerns wetlands. This type of habitat has been affected worldwide by widespread bonification, drainage, and land reclamation actions at various spatial scales. We are therefore talking of destruction of either large-scale wetland habitats such as swamps or coastal lagoons and bogs, but also of impacts related, for example, to the widespread cementing of riverbanks. In this image, we can see how the channelization of the natural meanders has led to a significant loss of wetland areas, since the banks of the channels have been cemented and straightened, eliminating the wetland habitat originally present in the river meanders. One of the most striking cases of habitat alteration concerns the loss of primary forests. A primary forest is one that does not have clearly visible indications of human activities and no significant disturbances in ecological processes, including the presence of non-native species. Primary forests now cover about 1 billion hectares and face different kinds of pressures that alter their structure and functioning. Logging and timbering, fire, this one particularly concentrated in the tropical regions of Africa and South America, emerging diseases and invasive insects, beside severe weather events. All these impacts resulted in a widespread loss of primary forests that represent today about 1/3 of the total forest cover worldwide, and a minor part in all the biogeographic domains. Primary forests have decreased globally by about 81 million hectares since 1990, and the bulk of impacts have affected even the genetic diversity of many tree species. But the good news is that the rate of loss halved in the last decade when compared to the previous one. Forest loss and habitat degradation has consequences on the whole community living in this habitat. There are many cases showing how species strictly associated to primary forest environment, and hence having high ecological requirements, are threatened by habitat alteration. For example, the European bison has been brought on the brink of extinction due to the dramatic loss of primary forests in Europe, with the last few specimens surviving in the primary remnant parcels of Baia Luisa forest. By the way, these few specimens have been used for a successful reintroduction of the species throughout Europe. This strong link between terrestrial biodiversity and forests emerges clearly when we consider that forests provide habitats for about 80% of amphibian species, 75% of birds, and 68% of mammal species, not mentioning that about 60% of all vascular plants occur in tropical forests. An example of how degrading forestal habitats threatens flagship species is the case of the Sorillis forest. This forest is located in northeastern Sardinia, and its habitat is highly degraded due to intensive land use, including timbering, and frequent occurrence of fires, which both have profoundly altered the original vegetation structure. Consequently, nowadays, the formations most represented are scrubland and garrigue, that are replacement vegetation. This ecosystem simplification, caused by the reduction in environmental variety and highlighted by the disappearance of the original forest cover, has led to a marked simplification of both the floristic contingent and the fauna. Species such as the Cinereus vulture, once present in the area, have been affected by the removal of tree cover, once represented by majestic olm oaks, cork oaks, and honey oaks, on which this large vulture used to build its nest, resulting in its eventual local extinction. Habitat alteration frequently proceeds through habitat fragmentation. This is a dynamic process which divides portions of the natural environment into disjoint fragments of smaller size. For example, a road built through a woodland is an obstacle that can hardly be crossed, or not at all, for much of the wildlife that lives in the wood. This is a barrier, effectively dividing the wood. What was once a single habitat has then become two or more smaller habitats. Habitat fragmentation, however, not only divides habitat in smaller parcels, but is frequently associated with habitat loss, when the total amount of habitat is reduced. Indeed, the same human activities and pressures causing habitat fragmentation are frequently the same that promote habitat destruction. Deforestation is very often associated with habitat fragmentation. In the case of American forests, we can see how, in the early stages of deforestation impact, the vegetation becomes fragmented, but with a relatively small habitat loss. In this phase, which is represented in the A part of the graph, there will be many small patches, which we find on the left side of the graph at a high frequency, but also forest areas of significant size, represented by the bar on the far right of the graph. As the deforestation process continues, we notice that the number of large patches progressively decreases until they completely disappear once we pass the so-called critical point. At that point, only small, disconnected patches of forest will survive, and the total forest area will be significantly reduced. Such insularization may cause negative effects at the population level, such as demographic decrease, since populations too will be subdivided in smaller subpopulations occupying single parcels. Ecological connections as well will be missed among populations that will remain isolated due to the presence of anthropogenic barriers. This will in turn block the gene flow among subpopulations, hence promoting genetic erosion. Habitat fragmentation has among its various negative effects the so-called edge effect. The edge effect is the set of ecological changes that occur right along the boundaries of habitat fragments. Indeed, it is along the edge of the patch that occurs the contact between the original habitat, say a forest, and the area impacted by anthropogenic activities, for example a road. This means that the parts of the patch that are in contact with the disturbed area will receive some degree of anthropogenic disturbance from it. For example, the noise will enter from the road into the wood. This influence is more significant in percentage terms for smaller patches. This is because the thickness of the edge affected by the disturbance remains more or less constant, regardless of the size of the fragment, as the ability of the disturbance to penetrate depends on the nature of the disturbance itself, and not on the size of the patch. This means that the smaller the patch, the greater the portion, the percentage, reached by disturbance through the edge. In the end, if the patch is very small, nearly its entire surface is actually affected by the disturbance penetrating from the outside. In a very small fragment of wood, the noise of the road will be heard from everywhere. Among the many negative consequences that occur at the boundaries of habitat fragments due to the edge effect, we can list an increasing in wind damage, changes in temperature and humidity, an increased probability of flooding, a higher trees mortality, a lower height of the canopy, and the loss of soil-littered invertebrates in terms of either diversity, abundance, or biomass, and in particular, we record a generalized decreasing of the so-called interior species. A consequence of edge effect is that the parcels have not only a smaller area, but also a lower ecological quality. We can differentiate an interior habitat and an edge habitat. Interior habitat is basically immune from human activity, can support larger populations, greater biodiversity, and provides more protected area for foraging, hunting, and breeding. On the contrary, the edge habitat is subjected to all the negative ecological consequences that we have just listed. This means that species with higher ecological requirements, and therefore needing a high-quality habitat as well as a wide home range, cannot survive where the remaining patches are particularly small. This is why habitat fragmentation causes local extinctions of the so-called interior species, the one that need a large amount of untouched, pristine environment, and these interior species will be replaced by species that are more tolerant to human disturbance, the so-called edge species, which are able to survive also in partially disturbed habitats, as are the edge habitat. The second category of pressures listed in the Evil Quartet is overexploitation. In ecology, the term overexploitation or overharvesting refers to depleting the population of a species more quickly than it can reproduce and recover. Therefore, the semi-renewable nature of biodiversity is the background for overexploitation to occur. The ecological footprint analysis allows quantifying the human exploitation of natural resources against the biosphere's capacity to regenerate resources and sustain ecosystem services. This measure evaluates the amount of biologically productive land and marine areas needed to produce the resources consumed and to absorb the resulting waste. The overall results, at whatever scale, show that use of biological resources and waste emission exceeds the available biological capacity of our planet. This is true, for example, in Europe, which cannot sustainably satisfy its consumption needs within its own borders. In other words, European ecological footprint is of 4.7 global hectares per person, which is twice its biocapacity. Forests are unfortunately a pivotal example of unsustainable overinvesting, since trees have been perceived for a long time as an undefined resource without acknowledging the biological nature of living beings, requiring the maintenance of their population features, of the genetic diversity of their gene pool, and the functionality of ecosystem relationships. Since 1990, 420 million hectares of forest have been lost due to human activities, including land clearing for agricultural farming and logging. Although the rate of deforestation has decreased over the past decade, we are losing thousands of hectares more with every passing day, and in some regions, as for example the tropics, the increasing trend is still ongoing. Besides the loss of biodiversity, forest loss contributes nearly 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year, which represent nearly 10% of annual human emissions. The recent publication of the Red List of Timber Trees provides a global overview of the conservation status of the world's timber tree species. From the analysis of the nearly 5,000 timber trees that have a conservation assessment on the IUCN Red List, it emerges that logging and wood harvesting is the most common threat to timber tree, affecting nearly 60% of the species. We are used to think that threatened species are rare or endemic or both, but timber species are often common and widespread. Nonetheless, many of them are now under threat due to overexploitation for timber and with that demand still increasing. This is particularly true for species harvested for their luxury wood, also fueling the illegal timber industry. Additionally, logging can have more impact on a forest behind just the removal of trees, with machinery which may damage the ecosystem, impacting regeneration of timber tree species and causing the thinning of forests, making them more susceptible to further threats from fire, pests, diseases, and land use change. The third category of pressures that is listed in the heavy quartet is represented by the extinction chains. An extinction chain takes place when human impact disrupts the structure of the food chain through an alteration of the trophic cascade. A trophic cascade is the propagation of indirect effects by predators across the lower trophic levels, and is based on the knowledge that the demographic control that predators have on their prey may cause inverse patterns of abundance and biomass among trophic groups. If predators are removed from the trophic chain, this may trigger extinctions at many different trophic levels in the ecosystem. A typical example is the one concerning the National Park of Yellowstone, where wolves were completely eradicated since considered dangerous pests. The disappearance of the wolf, however, entailed an extinction chain. Since the wolf disappeared, the deer populations were no more controlled in their number, being the natural prey of wolf, which regulated the demographic density through predation intensity. This large, uncontrolled deer population increased the grazing pressure on plants, with particular adverse effects on young trees that were eaten before they could grow tall enough to survive grazing. In a few decades, the landscape resulted highly modified, with an extreme simplification of plant community, which in turn had heavy consequences on many different species. For example, the songbirds were numerous and belonging to many species, but their community in the end missed most of its diversity. The beavers nearly disappeared because they were lacking the wood to build up their dams, and so went lost species of amphibians and waterfowl used to benefit of the calm pools created by beavers' engineering. The role of trophic cascade in this extinction chain was proved indisputably when the park decided to reintroduce the wolf. The situation reversed quite quickly, since wolves started to reduce the density of deers, so allowing the restoration of woods, which in turn allowed the area to be recolonized from birds, beavers, waterfowl, and many of the previously disappeared species. The relationships between trophic cascades and extinction chains is a concept well known and established in theoretical ecology, but it still lacks acquiring the deep knowledge needed to be fully applied in management. In fact, we are used to see food chains represented in an extremely simplified way, with very few predators feeding on a limited number of prey, which in turn rely on a slightly larger number of primary producers. However, food webs are much more complex than this. They are currently studied and represented using the same network methodologies applied to neural networks, and it is known that a moderately complex ecological system has, among its species, a number of connections roughly comparable to those found in a human brain. A partially simplified example can be seen in this representation of the food web in the tropical forest of the Luquillo Mountains. The fourth item, listed in the EVIR Quartet, pertains to non-native species. Alloctonous species are those that are able to live, reproduce, and establish viable populations outside their original biogeographical range. These species have reached new settlement areas due to human activities. For some of these species, the transportation is intentional. For example, domestic animals were transported by humans during migrations and colonization. However, in many cases, this transportation is unintentional. For instance, plant parasites may move from one continent to another associated to their hosts, or marine species inadvertently arrive as fooling organisms on fishing and aquaculture equipment. Non-native species are widespread also among forest trees, and there is a remarkable number of non-native tree species in European forests, with higher concentration in Central Europe, including Italy. If non-native species become problematic, they are said invasive. The terms non-native and invasive are often used interchangeably, but this is incorrect, because an invasive species is an exotic species that has a negative impact on the biodiversity of the ecosystem and the community into which it is introduced. For example, at European level, 13% of all the introduced tree species have become invasive, with impacts on forest biodiversity and conservation. Invasive species are a major threatening factor for about 40% of endangered species. Through predation, competition for resources like food and water, and transmission of diseases, invasive species may cause the decline of native species and disrupt the important interactions that contribute to healthy native ecosystems.
massive vines that blanket the southern United States, climbing as high as 100 feet as they uproot trees and swallow buildings. A ravenous snake that is capable of devouring an alligator. Rabbit populations that eat themselves into starvation. These aren't horror movie concepts, they're real stories. But how could such situations exist in nature? All three are examples of invasive species, organisms harmful not because of what they are, but where they happen to be. The kudzu vine, for example, had grown quietly in its native East Asia, eaten by various insects and dying off during the cold winters. But its fortunes changed when it was imported into the southeastern United States for porch decoration and cattle feed. Its planting was even subsidized by the government to fight soil erosion. With sunny fields, a mild climate, and no natural predators in its new home, the vine grew uncontrollably until it became known as the plant that ate the South. Meanwhile, in Florida's Everglades, Burmese pythons, thought to have been released by pet owners, are the cause of decreasing populations of organisms. They're successfully outcompeting top predators, such as the alligator and panther, causing a significant reduction in their food sources. They're not a problem in their native Asia because diseases, parasites, and predators help to control their population size. And in Australia, European rabbits eat so many plants that they wipe out the food supply for themselves and other herbivores. They're a pretty recent addition, intentionally introduced to the continent because one man enjoyed hunting them. Like the Burmese pythons, various factors in their native habitat keep their numbers in control. But in Australia, the lack of predators and a climate perfect for year-long reproduction allows their populations to skyrocket. So why does this keep happening? Most of the world's ecosystems are the result of millennia of co-evolution by organisms, adapting to their environment and each other until a stable balance is reached. Healthy ecosystems maintain this balance via limiting factors, environmental conditions that restrict the size or range of a species. These include things like natural geography and climate, food availability, and the presence or absence of predators. For example, plant growth depends on levels of sunlight and soil nutrients. The amount of edible plants affects the population of herbivores, which in turn impacts the carnivores that feed on them. And a healthy predator population keeps the herbivores from becoming too numerous and devouring all the plants. But even minor changes in one factor can upset this balance, and the sudden introduction of non-native organisms can be a pretty major change. A species that has evolved in a separate habitat will be susceptible to different limiting factors, different predators, different energy sources, and different climates. If the new habitat's limiting factors fail to restrict the species' growth, it will continue to multiply, outcompeting native organisms for resources and disrupting the entire ecosystem. Species are sometimes introduced into new habitats through natural factors like storms, ocean currents, or climate shifts. The majority of invasive species, though, are introduced by humans. Often this happens unintentionally, as when the zebra mussel was accidentally brought to Lake Erie by cargo ships. But as people migrate around the world, we have also deliberately brought our plants and animals along, rarely considering the consequences. But now that we're learning more about the effects of invasive species on ecosystems, many governments closely monitor the transport of plants and animals and ban the imports of certain organisms. But could the species with the most drastic environmental impact be a group of primates who emerged from Africa to cover most of the world? Are we an invasive species?